I'm Carla Rowe, and I'm actually going to be just kind of your host today for all these wonderful people who've joined us. I really appreciate it. I've had an awful lot of fun getting ready for this, in the sense that I had never met Dr. Wald before, and for me, it was just really kind of a delight to do that. So this will be something that I think we'll kind of look back on and really appreciate this. And I appreciate very much that she's taken her time. So getting started today, we always have a very few just little slides that we like to remind, kind of set the tone for our time together. Because since we do a lot of anti-racism work, things can be challenging to hear about, and we like to make sure that we create an environment that's safe for everybody. So our mission is to confront racism and to engage in dismantling the systems that perpetuate ingrained racial inequality. So we try to have events, education, outreach, etc., and we want all to be treated with equality and respect. The views and thoughts and opinions at some of our presentations, they definitely are those of the individuals presenting, and they may or may not reflect the feelings of the Take Bar board member opinions, but we welcome the diversity of thought. It's also really wonderful that we're able to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we live. And in the Portland area, it's the homeland of the Cathlamet, the Clackamas, Chinook peoples, Tualatin, Kalapoya, and Molalla. And there's other Native people who live here and have always lived here and who always belonged to and cared for this land. So we have a great deal of respect for that. All the work we do is made possible in part by the local spiritual assembly of the Baha'is of Portland and from contributions from people like you, because we are actually a volunteer organization. And so we've been doing this for quite a while, and we really appreciate all of you. And we do it in partnership with the Association for Human Advancement and Development. I love this new slide. It never used to be here. So now we know we've arrived. You can follow us on Facebook or Twitter or YouTube. And the fact that I know that that's a bird is Twitter, this is good. So I love it if you'd be happy to follow us. We do have a few very simple communication agreements. So what we're trying to do is listen more. And if you're uncomfortable, listen even more. Engage in the tension of the question, but let's not do drama. And one of my favorites is, why am I talking? Wait, because perhaps somebody's already made that point. Perhaps somebody who hasn't had a chance to speak up needs to speak up. And finally, our goal is consultation and collaboration. This is not a competitive event. So we want to maintain a safe space for difficult conversations. We're happy that everyone can take away the lessons learned and any insights you gain, but we kind of stay away from who said what and why in a negative way. Now we're going to do Q&A, and I'm going to give you more direction on that, but we're going to have a talk first, and then Q&A will follow. And I will remind you at that time, there's several ways you can participate. You can, use your chat button in the reactions. You can put your hand up on the screen. You can type a question into the chat, and we'll be watching for questions there as well. So you'll have a chance to ask Dr. Wald all the questions that you may come up with during her talk. If you think of some during the talk, why don't you go ahead and write them into the chat so we don't lose track of them. And that way we can make sure that we get a chance to hear all of your questions. So this is going to be our talk today. Racial justice and public lands. And I think this is going to be really an interesting talk. As I was saying in our informal gathering, I had a lot of fun reading through some of the bio. Particularly, I enjoyed Dr. Wald's, I had her course overview for this particular, I think it's a semester, but anyway, it was a course overview, and to kind of look at what's going to be covered and some of her past work is really amazing. So it's my pleasure to be able to introduce Dr. Sarah Wald. She's an associate professor of environmental studies and English at the University of Oregon. She engages the intersections of race and environment in the 20th and the 21st century. And she looks at US literature and culture and kind of ties that all together. She's the co-editor of Latinx Environmentalisms, Place, Justice, and the Decolonial. She's also the author of Nature of California, Race, Citizenship, and Farming Since the Dustbowl, which is, I believe, a book. And she's currently writing a book about racial justice, outdoor recreation, and public lands. She has her PhD in American Studies from Brown University and her Bachelor of Arts from Reed College. She's got a long history of public lands advocacy in the Pacific Northwest. And most notably, she was a former employee and later a board member of BARC. So BARC sounds like a very interesting organization that you might want to look up and learn a little bit more about. So having said that, I will hand this over to Dr. Wald, and I look forward to your talk.
So hello, everyone. And I am delighted to be able to speak with you today. And I want to start by thanking all of you for coming to this talk and spending your time thinking with me about these issues, about white supremacy and settler colonialism and the public lands that surround us. And I want to take part and the huge number of volunteers that have put so much time in putting this together, in particular Bernadette and Jane and Donna and Toby and Randy and Carla and Victoria and so many other people who I've had contact with as we're getting this talk together. So I've been really impressed with all of you and your organization. I am Zooming with you today from Eugene, Oregon, which is the traditional and unceded territorial homelands of the Kalapuya peoples. The University of Oregon is on unceded Kalapuya territory. And it's important to keep in mind throughout my talk today that whenever we're talking about public lands in the United States, we are always talking about native lands. Reckoning with this knowledge is a big part of the work I do and the ways I'm hoping to influence your thinking about this today. And the way I'm going to approach the talk is I'm going to spend the first part of it talking about the entanglements of racial justice, settler colonialism, and public lands. And then I'm going to talk about what are some work people are doing to create a more environmentally just future for public lands. And then I'm going to end by sharing some resources and taking questions while the resources are up being shared, just to give you a sense of where we're going. And I think it's important to think about where I'm coming from in this work. You know, I'm a white settler scholar. I'm an Ashkenazi Jewish person. And I come to this work thinking about settler colonialism and racial justice as somebody who was deeply involved in the Pacific Northwest environmental movement. I came to Oregon in the late 1990s as a 17-year-old to start college. This photo of me is 20 some years old. It's in a timber sale called the Solo Timber Sale. That's an old growth Pacific U. Behind me, it was the Solo Timber Sale, was an old growth clear cutting essentially sale in Mount Hood National Forest that many, many people came together and were able to stop. Solo was not logged. And as somebody who was really engaged in forest activism and also was taking classes in ethnic studies and thinking about race and the environment, I really had to grapple with a lot of the history that I was learning and how it undermined some of the assumptions that was fueling my activism and caused me to question a lot of the ways that I was thinking and feeling and acting. And I felt a responsibility to do that work and to have that introspection. I'm still on that particular journey, but that's really the framework I come. It's both as a scholar and as someone who's been deeply invested in these movements for a long time, and specifically in Oregon. I want to talk about settler colonialism and public lands first, and then move into racial inequities in public lands use, employment, and storytelling. I think we can't really talk about racial injustice on public lands without first grappling with the ongoing legacy of settler colonialism. And I want to think with you for a minute about what settler colonialism is. And it's a term that was popularized first by the scholar Patrick Wolfe. The slide I have up here, the chart I have up here, is by the sociologist Jay Bacon. I think it's a fantastic way to think about settler colonialism. And settler colonialism as a term came about how to think about colonialism in places like the United States and Australia that's operating differently than we might think of a sort of traditional colonialism, where there's an expropriation, an exploitation of land and labor. But there's not settler colonialism is different in that there's an attempt to, often unsuccessful attempt to displace, erase, and replace Indigenous populations. And Bacon here has listed 4 different ways in which this can happen, right? A sort of an attempt at physical elimination or genocide. And in the context of the United States, we can talk about a number of massacres. We can also talk about forced sterilizations, an attempt at cultural erasures. And I'm thinking many of you have heard, at least recently in the news, a lot of the stories about boarding schools, right? Taking children away from their parents to abusive situations where they weren't allowed to speak their native languages, and that an attempt at a cultural erasure. When we're talking about political elimination, we can talk about not recognizing tribes, right? Taking away tribal recognition, not affirming or following treaties. These are forms of political elimination. And then discursive elimination, which is both the underrepresentation and the misrepresentation of Indigenous peoples. And one of the things that's key to thinking about public lands in the United States is to understand that settler colonialism has environmental aspects, that settler colonialism is part of what Bacon calls ecological colonial violence. And so Bacon's chart, I really love the charts that social scientists produce as a humanities person, talks about how we can think about these 4 axes of these attempts at elimination and replacement in terms of the environment. So in terms of the physical, we can talk about the poisoning of food and water and the taking of water. For cultural elimination, we can talk about the disruption of ecological knowledge and ecological relationships and the massive loss of tribal land holdings, including through the Dawes Act. With political, we can talk about land losses, post-termination land losses, right? So tribes who lose federal recognition and the loss of land that comes with that. We can also talk about the loss of particular treaty rights that allow particular tribes to hunt or fish on lands off reservations, often on national forests and national parks. And when that is not recognized or that is not honored, there's a attempt at political erasure. And then of course, the discursive erasure, we can think about the renaming of culturally significant places, the repurposing of culturally significant places as well. So think about rock climbing on sacred sites. We know that we have some understanding of the ways in which fire suppression, the long history of USFS fire suppression, enacted a form of ecological violence. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later on a number of different tribes. One of the things is that the Forest Service started putting up all these watchtowers, especially in the 1920s, and they often would put them up on sacred sites. So you have sacred sites near where people would start fires historically, and now there's a watchtower there that's specifically trying to put out these fires, right? These are kinds of repurposing of culturally significant places. When we talk about public lands and we talk about this concept of wilderness that we have, it's really important to know that wilderness as the concept we have today was not the way that wilderness was always thought about in the United States. And I have here a book by the Métis scholar Mark David Spence, an environmental historian, Dispossessing the Wilderness, Indian Removal, and the Making of National Parks. And one of the key things that Spence argues is that uninhabited wilderness had to be created before it could be preserved. And when we think about wilderness areas in the United States and we think about national parks and national forests, there's a long history, right, of how this comes to be public land. But these places are being formed in the same moment that reservations are being created. And a lot of Native peoples in their treaties reserve rights to hunt, to fish, to gather, to engage in cultural practices on these landscapes. And when these ecological relationships are disrupted, right, it now becomes poaching and it's not allowed, right? And the army is there in the 1890s, 1900s, preventing a lot of traditional uses, then there's a disruption of ecological relations and the landscape actually changes. And so these sort of untouched wilderness landscapes that many people, including me, came to love and sort of value as this untouched place are actually a creation of a very particular management activity within conservation. And that's a history that we don't talk, I think, enough about in the mainstream environmental movement in the United States. And this is a rather long quote, and I have it up here because I want you to be able to read it along with me, but it's by Spence, who I was mentioning, and I think it just does a really wonderful job of capturing some of the ideas that I just said. Americans have long celebrated the uninhabited landscapes preserved in large national parks like Glacier as remnants of a priori nature with a very capital N, which they conflate with romantic visions of primordial America. Such an idea of wilderness conveniently neglects the facts that Indians profoundly shaped these landscapes. National parks are more representative of old fantasies about a continent awaiting discovery than actual conditions at the time of Columbus's voyage or Lewis and Clark's adventure. In many respects, the wilderness preserved in national parks is as much a fanciful product of American culture as the elaborate hotels built by the Great Northern Railway in 1910s. Several scholars have argued recently that wilderness itself is a historical construct. They point to the fact that national parks preserve areas that did not become uninhabited until after the Indians who called them home had been confined to their reservations. The creation of the first national parks actually preceded efforts to remove Indians from prized wilderness areas, and programs for Indian removal from Yellowstone, Yosemite, and the Grand Canyon, for example, did not begin until after these areas were preserved. And he documents a transition in the concept of wilderness from an idea in which Native Americans were incorporated into the American conception of wilderness and to an idea of wilderness as an area where there are no humans, right? That's sort of untrammeled by man. That's part of the 1964 Wilderness Act. And that transition happened after some of these areas were named as national parks and resulted in taking away existing treaty rights for people, for particular tribes. And there's long legacies of conflicts in the Pacific Northwest and other places, like between Glacier National Park and the Blackfeet, around these treaty rights. I want to give you a case study of this. And a case study of this, I want to particularly talk about the Crook people. And we're talking about Northern California. You can see here, this is a territorial map from the Crook people. They're the largest tribe in California. It's a really important story about fire. So I started talking away from my notes, and I want to get to my notes on this. And when we're talking, I'm going to tell you that a lot of what I'm going to tell you right now, when I look at the case study of the Crook peoples and fire as an example of colonial ecological violence and as an example of forest management policies disrupting ecological relations, it's coming from Kari Norgaard's book, Salmon and Acorns Feed Our People, which shares copyright with the Crook tribe because it is representative of knowledge that Norgaard gained from the tribe, right? There's a lot of tribal knowledge. This is really an important part of recognizing this work. And when you're talking about traditional management and fire in these areas, there was an active management of a huge number of food and cultural use species through setting particular kinds of low intensity fires. And the Crook people for time immemorial had developed knowledge of species and ecological conditions and knowledge of how to reproduce them, that there's a kind of, this isn't some sort of accidental production of the bounty of nature. It's active forms of management and relationality through practices that include fire that help these species reproduce, and the particular species that are being reproduced are being used for food and for culture. And this includes bulb selection and harvest techniques. And I emphasize this idea of management because I think there's a way in which the popular discourse takes away these generations of knowledge and these the fact that this is a form of knowledge and expertise and a form of management that we can see is very different from what the Forest Service then tried to enact, that in many ways created what we might see as food deserts in areas that were very food rich and disrupted a lot of cultural traditions. So fire was central to this management. And I listed here a huge number of ways in which fire is central to correct management in reducing fuel buildup, maintaining open grasslands, shading rivers, which is important to fish and healthy fish runs. And it was really important to the growth and productivity of many, many food sources. And 3/4 of the food and cultural use species of the Karuk peoples benefit from fire. This is a key part of this relationship. So colonial ecological violence disrupts this relationship to fire and then disrupts access to food species, access to cultural species. And when you think about dispossession, there's a dispossession that comes from losing land. There's also a dispossession that comes when the species and the ecological relationships on the land have been so fundamentally transformed that it's hard to enact acts of harvesting and cultural acts that are important to a sense of identity, a sense of belonging, a sense of what it means to be a particular peoples in a particular place. And we can talk about this long history of fire exclusion in the West. The Forest Service at one point had a 10 a.m. policy, right? All fires were, the idea was to put them out by 10 a.m. There was no fire, right? Rather than what you might see as a kind of prescribed burning that was happening traditionally. But it's not just about fire. We can talk about dams, blocking access to spring Chinook spawning habitat, mining, logging, fishing, and hunting that are organized around non-native values and often in ways that prevented native peoples from engaging in traditional fishing and hunting activities, insufficient access to deer, acorns, mushrooms, disruption of these relationships. So I really want to think about this kind of colonial ecological violence and the ecological aspects of settler colonialism as foundational to any work we're going to do thinking about racial justice on public lands. And so I'm going to switch now to talk a little bit about public lands, and I'm going to come back to thinking about settler colonialism. Outdoor recreation is really, really popular on public lands. In 2006, 3 out of every 4 Americans engaged in outdoor recreation. And in 2018, more than half of all Americans engaged in outdoor recreation. And the studies are still coming out about post-COVID outdoor recreation. But what we know, what studies are showing us, is the numbers are going up and up. So this is an incredibly common way that people who live, settlers who live in the United States, engage with the outdoors. And a lot of this recreation happens on public lands. The vast majority happens on public lands. And I think sometimes we forget how much land in the United States is public land, is land owned and managed by the federal government, the state government, the local government. 1/3 of every acre in the United States is local, state, or federal public land. And there's a long talk I could give about the very specific forms of violence and ways settler colonialism operated to lead this land into federal hands, right, into public hands. And there's also a talk that could be given on what it means for it to be in public hands rather than private hands. But it's important that we're really talking about a large amount of land and that most outdoor recreation happens on public lands. In Oregon, 97% of hiking trails and 95% of skiing trails are on US federal lands. In the US West more broadly, 76% of human-powered outdoor recreation takes place on US federal lands. And so when I'm talking about racial justice and racial equity on public lands and in outdoor recreation, you'll often hear me go back and forth between public lands and outdoor recreation. And a lot of the organizations doing this work do the same. And that's because so much outdoor recreation happens on public lands. And studies show that white people are overrepresented as participants in outdoor recreation and users of public land. And I debated how many studies I could show you on this. There's a huge number, I mean, dozens, and they all show the same thing. And there's slight variations of the number. But I went with this this study here, which is what you're seeing on your screen, is the United States Forest Service National Visitor Use Monitoring data from 2015 to 2019. And it was some of the last data available from before the COVID-19 pandemic, which of course reshaped outdoor recreation patterns. And what I did here is put the patterns in the context of the 2019 census estimates of the US population. So I want to point out here that the census estimate is that the white population is about 60% of the United States, but they're taking up 95.3% of national forest visits, 94.2% of wilderness visits. And you'll notice the numbers don't quite add up to 100 in all the categories. That's because the census used a mixed race category that the visitor use surveys did not use. But that's a clear overrepresentation. And if you look at the Black population, 13.4% of the United States population, but only 1.2% of national forest visits, only 0.9% of wilderness visits. And why does this matter? There's a number of reasons, but one thing to think about is that there's a huge amount of federal and state and local resources that go into managing federal lands and structuring outdoor recreation. And if these are set up in ways that it's primarily benefiting white outdoor recreationists, there's not racial equity there, right? And there's a lot of assumptions that we can go into in terms of how these numbers are created, right? What kind of, what gets counted as outdoor recreation, how these numbers are created, who is doing these studies and in what ways that might shift what these numbers look like. But we can say that there's a significant equity gap in the use of public lands for outdoor recreation. So actually, I want to stick with this for a second longer to say that in addition to these kind of numerical disparities, researchers have shown that when people of color engage in outdoor recreation on public land, they exhibit different participation patterns. They have different motivations. They're more likely to recreate in urban national forests due to proximity to urban residences. They're more likely to engage in day use than multi-day recreation. Deborah Chavez is a social scientist who's done a huge number of these studies, and she and her collaborators have demonstrated that Latinos congregate at particular sites in Southern California rather than sort of equally across all urban national forests. They're more likely to attend recreation sites that family and friends have previously visited. And for many, especially more recent Mexican immigrants, they're more likely to go recreate at natural areas that remind them of home. And so this again suggests that people of color are not being equally served by outdoor recreation planning and management that centers white experiences and preferences, right? So if you're sort of figuring out who's going to national parks and you're standing at a particular trailhead and you're asking people their identities or you're guessing at identities, and we know that's not the place that the local Mexican American community is going, you're going to get the wrong numbers, right? This is part of how this inequity gets captured in the social science and then magnified in terms of management decisions. So there's lots of reasons for inequities, for racial inequities in public lands uses. There's economic, geographic, infrastructure barriers. So think about not having a car and needing to rely on public transportation, proximity to these places, having the money to pay for the gas, to pay for the park service pass, having what gets called a racialized outdoor leisure identity, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more, but that's about the public perception that camping is a white thing, right? All the outdoor REI ads we see that show white families or white couples, white heterosexual couples out enjoying the outdoors. There's a long history of exclusion and discrimination that shapes this. Public lands often celebrate white histories, right? They're the stories that get told at national park sites tell particular kinds of histories and don't tell other histories. And there's also what I'm going to call a hierarchy of uses, which means an assumption that particular kinds of uses of public lands are better or more environmental than others. So we sort of, as a dominant culture, will imagine backpacking and the multi-day through hiking as somehow more environmental or more cool or more accomplished than a short hike or a day trip or a family picnic. And that this plays into these inequities in public land usage. And I think a key thing here is, you're not going to find one reason that explains everything. It's the intersections of all these different reasons. And race and ethnicity are not the only factors here. Class absolutely plays a role in this disparities. Wealthy Americans are 3 times more likely to visit national parks than poor Americans. But the research has repeatedly shown that these economic disparities don't explain racial and ethnic inequalities. They just exacerbate the existing racial and ethnic inequities. And so I wanted you to keep that in mind in terms of how class and race intersect in this. One thing that is not a reason is that it's not this idea that people of color, that Black, Latinx, Asian Americans are not environmentalists, that they don't have environmental ideologies. There is this idea that I heard for years, for decades in the environmental movement, oh, our environmental group is only white because Black people are dealing with racism. They don't have time for environmentalism. That's a white thing. It's not because there's some sort of culture in which people of color aren't comfortable in our organizations. Polling data repeatedly shows that there is much stronger support for environmental protection, including the protection of public lands, among Black, Latinx, Asian American, and Pacific Islander populations than among white populations. So this idea of not having environmental values or environmental values not being important enough for these particular demographic groups, and that's why you have more white outdoor recreationists. That's just not that's the answer we know is not true. So I want to review some cautions. When I start talking about this material, and I lecture to hundreds of undergraduates on this every year, I've learned there's some certain patterns in how we tend to react, how dominant culture has trained us to react. And I want to mention some of these now. One is I think it's really important to avoid homogenization. There's a way in which the racial project of whiteness operates to give white people individuality that's denied people of color that are often grouped together. So there's this tendency to say, this is why Black people don't do this, or this is how Black people think about nature, rather than recognizing that there's many different reasons that individual Black people don't like hiking or do like hiking, right? And that we often don't ask that question about, white people. There's plenty of white people who don't like hiking too, but white people are allowed to have an individuality in the public discourse that people of color are often denied. So just be careful of that in the way you're thinking about that. One of the other things that I think happens is, this is a phrase by Julie Guthman, if only they knew. And this, one example to think about this is food deserts, is this idea that, or public lands, like, well, if people only knew that nature was good for you, or if people only knew how easy it was to get to the national forest, or if people only knew that they should be eating organic tomatoes and not McDonald's, which doesn't recognize that people do know that communities of color do have these knowledge and these legacies and these relationships. It's a way of making it about individual ignorance and not about structural and systemic barriers. And I'm going to encourage you to think about structural and systemic barriers and the way power and privilege operates in society, rather than that individualization. I often find too that if I give 10 reasons why people of color don't hike at the same numbers as white people in wilderness areas, the thing that sticks out to people that they latch onto is this idea of fear. And often it's very inaccurate, a sort of fear of wild animals, a fear that they're afraid because they're not used to nature. That's not true. Black people are not more afraid of encountering a cougar while hiking than white people. And what you will see in a lot of stories and studies is fears based on people, right? On encountering violence, on encountering white racists in the backwoods, right? And that is absolutely part of the reason. But again, there's a sort of over attention to individual fear, which takes the responsibility, I think, for white listeners and for white participants off of them as individuals and their complicity in these sort of structural factors. So again, I'm going to say these legacies of fear are important, but don't give them too much power. And I'm going to encourage you all to think about, do you assume that one way of recreating on public lands is superior to others? And if so, why? And I also want to ask the question is that the social science on this topic is often framed as how do we get more Black people hiking, or why don't Asian Americans hike at the same numbers of white people? What happens if we flip the question? Why are we normalizing the position of what white people do? And what happens if we ask, why do white people go hiking and why are they overrepresented? So to get into a little more detail about some of these areas, the racialized outdoor leisure identity, which is a term that Christopher Martin was the first to use, really talks about the ways that magazines tend to show white people recreating. And there's been a huge amount of effort to change this. So you'll see in like REI commercials have dramatically changed in the last decade because of social movement pressure to counter this idea that outdoor leisure has been racialized as a white thing. And even in cases where we know that's just not true, the dominant picture becomes of white people doing this. And this holds in advertisements across magazines that are geared towards white audiences, but also Martin looked at magazines like Ebony as well, where when Black people were shown recreating, it was often outdoors, it was often in an urban environment doing something like basketball, whereas white couples were shown often these sort of couples or family units out camping or hiking, the way we have in this advertisement. And this is part of a longer history, a longer legacy of racist imagery around people of color and nature. And I'm going to show you one of these images. And some of you may remember this particularly controversial, I think for obvious reasons when you see the comparison, 2008 cover of Vogue magazine with LeBron James that is, I think, very clearly echoing visually this racist 1917 World War I poster. And there's a long history in European and American thought of thinking about monkeys and apes and gorillas as a way to think about the limitations of human, what it means to be not human, but close to human. And because of the ways that racism wrote Black people and other people of color as not quite human, there's a depiction of Black people as gorillas or monkeys or apes, right? That this is, and there's this sort of idea about Black people as being closer to nature, but closer to nature in a way that is not quite human or that is sort of categorized as primitive, which makes for a particularly complicated relationship for many Black people and people of color to nature because of these racist legacies. And I think the literary critic Paul Otka puts this really beautifully. This legacy in which whites viewed Black people as part of the natural world and then proceeded to treat them with the same mixture of contempt, false reverence, and real exploitation that also marks American environmental history inevitably makes the possibility of an uncomplicated union with the natural world less readily available to African Americans than it has been to whites, who by and large have not suffered from such a history. So these complicated legacies are real and shapes people's experience of the natural world and public lands and outdoor recreation. Another passage that I think will help you understand this is from the poet Langston Hughes, from an essay he published in 1947. And he says at the beginning of it, I have had one threatening communication signed a Klansman, and many scurrilous, anonymous anti-Negro letters from persons whose writings did not always indicate illiteracy. So goes the life of a social poet. I am sure none of these things would have ever happened to me had I limited the subject matter of my poems to roses and moonlight. But unfortunately, I was born poor and colored, and almost all of the prettiest roses I have seen have been in rich white people's yards, not in mine. That is why I cannot write exclusively about roses and moonlight. For sometimes in the moonlight, my brothers see a fiery cross and a circle of Klansmen's hoods. Sometimes in the moonlight, a dark body swings from a lynching tree. But for his funeral, there are no roses. And there is a whole lot we could say about this passage, but I want to emphasize 2 points. One, the thinking about roses, the idea about being a poet who thinks about roses and moonlight and thinks about roses and moonlight outside of history, outside of a social context, a cultural context, is itself a kind of privilege. And second, people are going to experience, not everyone's going to see roses or see moonlight or see a tree and think the same thing, have that same experience, because there's different historical and cultural context for what seeing a tree in the moonlight might mean. It doesn't necessarily convey the same aesthetic beauty depending on your social, cultural, historical context. And there's a long history of exclusion and violence in nature and public lands, including segregated campgrounds that were not equally maintained, whites only signs in many public spaces. There's, as I mentioned, and Hughes mentions, an African-American history of physical and psychological violence in rural and wild spaces, and an African-American history of experiencing physical and psychological violence when traveling. And you think about where the traveling that has to happen to get to Yellowstone or Yosemite or other national parks. And I want to say, I think in terms of traveling, you can also think about the history of sundown towns across the West, right? Towns where if you were a person of color, it was not safe to be there after sundown, and what that meant to sort of traveling to the sort of idea, the sort of white idea of the classic American road trip to a national park. And I want to share a story that the geographer Carolyn Finney often tells. In 1960, a white theology professor from Boston University wanted to plan a vacation at a national park in Canada for himself, his wife, and an African-American couple with which he was good friends, with who he was good friends with. And because there was a lot of hostility towards Black people in the US at this time, they're going to go to a national park in Canada. And he wants to write the owner of the hotel ahead of time to make sure that things are going to go smoothly. In his letter, he said he was confident his friends would be treating well, but he just wanted to check. He describes the husband as university trained with 4 degrees and an author. And the owner writes back and says that they will not accept them. They could not accept the possibility of an embarrassment which may arise from the situation because of how many American guests are at the site. And the couple that this person is trying to bring to the national park is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his wife, Coretta Scott King. And this is in 1960. The 1964 Wilderness Act is on the cusp of being passed. There's a particular idea about going to wilderness, going to nature, right? Think about the writings of John Muir as a place of sanctitude, a place of peace. Here you have Reverend King, Coretta Scott King, trying to have that experience in a national park and being denied it. And this continues to happen today, right? This isn't just a historical legacy. Some of you probably remember what happened to Christian Cooper, who was a bird watcher. He's watching birds in Central Park in a particular park called the Rambles. There was a white woman named Amy Cooper, who was not related to him, who was walking her dog off leash. It's an area where it's very clearly posted that your dog should be on leash to not disturb the birds. He asks her to put her dog on a leash. She tells him that if he doesn't leave her alone, she's going to call the cops and tell them she's being threatened by an African-American man. She then proceeds to call the cops and tell them she's being threatened by an African-American man. He gets it all on tape. When she finally puts a leash on her dog, he says thanks and walks away, and the video goes viral. And Carolyn Finney, who I mentioned earlier, wrote, "I wish I could feign surprise at what happened to Christian Cooper when he encountered Amy Cooper in Central Park. I wish I could imagine it to be a blip in United States history, an accident, an outlier, not at all reflective of the truth of how Black people are all too often treated. But I can't." And in addition to this history of exclusion, there's a really complicated and problematic history to the founding of national parks in terms of the racial politics of many conservation leaders. And I have here the pictures of Madison Grant, Gifford Pinchot, and John Muir. Madison Grant is not talked about often, although he was key to the conservation movement. He wrote a book called The Passing of the Great Race, or the Racial Bias of European History, in 1916, which is a sort of pseudo-scientific work of white supremacy that was very influential. And his ideas about his racial theories, which go on to influence Hitler. Hitler calls the book a Bible. his Bible, influenced many people, many leading conservationists. Gifford Pinchot was very involved in ideas about eugenics. Muir is not a eugenicist, but he has really bad racial politics. He is, does not think of Native Americans or of Black Americans as fully human or as having the same ideas or ability to appreciate nature that he sees white people as having. And oftentimes, these stories are either dismissed as somehow a sign of the times, or you're sort of reflecting of the racial politics of the time and thus not something we need to worry about, or they're hidden, or they're seen as, in particular the case of Grant and Pinchot, as politics outside of the conservation movement, right? Some sort of other problematic politics they had, even if they had these good ideas about conservation. And I want to challenge that and think that what are the connections between these ideas about conservation and eugenics, and how might that have shaped what national parks look like and how they're managed, what national forests look like and how they're managed, that are further exclusionary beyond these very explicit segregationist rules. We can also think about the histories that national parks tell and don't tell as sites of national memory. This is a picture of Sheldon Johnson, National Park Ranger, who's done an amazing work around telling Black stories in national parks, including the Buffalo Soldiers in Yosemite. We can think about the huge gap in employment in national parks and National Forest Service. National Park Service, 83% of the employees are white, again, 60% of the population, disproportionately white employees. The person you see here is Betty Reed. Some of you may recognize her. There were a lot of news stories about her because she recently retired at age 100, the oldest serving National Park employee. And she actually started working for the National Park Service at age 84. And she was really involved. She was originally came on as a temporary grant employee to tell stories of African Americans in World War II. And she did amazing work telling the stories of not just African Americans, but particularly women of color in the post-World War II era and during World War II. And she talks for many times about being the only person of color in the room when these conversations about what histories are going to get told are going to be and who's going to get hired and what job ads are going to look like. And she talks as well about how much it meant to her to be walking around in this uniform and to see Black children look at her and know. She talks about how she is silently sending a message that this is a career option that is open to these children because they can see her in this position. And so you can think about the different ways in which underrepresentation in employment matters. And I want to go back to the point I said about the ways in which Black people and people of color are often not envisioned as environmentalists, and how that then leads to a lack of opportunities in environmental careers, and in a vision of these populations as not environmental stakeholders, that white people are assumed to be environmental stakeholders in a way that communities of color are often not, and that can change who gets to make decisions and who is consulted in these processes that have to do with the distribution of resources and affect community livelihoods. So with that, I want to move to some of the work that people are doing to change this. Some of the, hopeful stories. And one of the first things I want to do is emphasize that this is not a new thing, that fighting for racial justice on public lands and in these conservation careers has a long, long history. In 1927, Black Floridians sued the city of Fort Lauderdale to get access to public beaches, for example. I have a picture here of William Trent Jr., who was an advisor to the Secretary of Interior, Harold Ickes, during FDR's administration, and led the fight to desegregate campgrounds at national parks from within the Department of the Interior, while the NAACP led the fight from without. And because of that work, the National Park Service actually becomes the first federal agency to officially eliminate racial segregation from within its jurisdiction. right? Why is that not the story of Black camping that gets told? And more recently, Gloria Brown becomes the first Black woman to be appointed forest supervisor in the US Forest Service in 1999. And she did so here in Oregon. And I've got a picture here of her memoir. And she moves up the ranks of the Forest Service as a young widow, raising her children with her whole family, enduring explicit and implicit racism as she moves across these white spaces in the West. And in the late 1990s, she becomes the forest supervisor for the Siuslaw National Forest in Oregon. The next year, Leslie Weldon, later deputy chief for the National Forest Service, becomes the second Black woman forest supervisor in the entire USFS, again in Oregon, this time in the Deschutes National Forest. This is a poster that was created to illustrate an article about Carolyn Finney's book. And I just want to emphasize that I could spend hours telling you about amazing people, amazing Black heroes of the great outdoors, amazing Asian American, Latinx leaders of conservation of the environment, who many of you will not have heard of. And with this poster, I would encourage you to pull out a name of someone you don't know and look them up, because there are these long histories and stories that just don't get told. So another thing that we've seen happen, especially starting the Obama administration, was a vast expanse of the kinds of national monuments and national historic sites that are being created and the stories that are being told in those parks. And I have a picture here of the Cesar Chavez National Monument that's created, and a huge amount of work both inside of the Department of Interior and exterior to it goes into telling these new stories. And there's a lot of work going on addressing the diversity in employment issue in conservation and in federal land agencies. And I just pulled out 3 organizations here. Green 2.0, which has done a lot of work on the green ceiling and the lack of representation of people of color in big environmental organizations, and particularly about pathways to leadership positions. The Avarna Group does a lot of consulting with environmental groups, including on how to do better hiring practices and creating workplace cultures that are less hostile. The Next 100 Coalition, which was formed on the cusp of the 100th anniversary of the foundation of the National Park Service, did a lot of work on diversity in public lands. And in 2017, one of the last things Obama does before he leaves office is drop this presidential memorandum on diversity on public lands and waters that echoes many of the points of the Next 100 Coalition, which includes the NAACP and the JACL and Outdoor Afro and Latino Outdoors, and a huge number of other organizations have been pushing for. It's a huge success on their part. And then there's the outdoor equity movement. There are tons of these amazing groups, many of which have been formed since 2010, working within communities to change definitions of what outdoor recreation is, create cultural, comfortable places for people to come together and engage in outdoor recreation, and address some of these systemic barriers. And Outdoor Afro and Latino Outdoors are 2 of these. And there's many, many organizations like that, including in Portland, that are doing this kinds of work and that we can be supporting. One of the things I think we need to confront when thinking about all this work about racial justice and racial equity in terms of outdoor recreation and public lands, though, is again, this context, this is stolen native land. And so, a lot of people in the outdoor equity movement are doing this work and are thinking about what does it mean to be in coalition and in solidarity with tribal nations that are asking for land back, asking for co-management. And we can see there's both a power and a problem with these statements like the outdoors are for everyone and our public lands and these lands belong to us too. And so I want to think about some things we can be supporting in terms of supporting tribal sovereignty and tribal land rights. So one is supporting Indigenous traditional management. This is a screenshot from a CNN story about the Crook and fire, which I mentioned as my case study. And they're doing a lot of really amazing work to bring fire back into the landscape. And we can be supporting the rights to do traditional management on their lands and on federal lands, and in ways that maybe sometimes go against federal regulations. We can support efforts to uphold the treaties. This is an image of Glacier National Park. As I mentioned, there's been a long history of conflict between the Blackfeet and Glacier National Park management about not following treaty rights. So we can make sure that we stand on the side of making sure treaty rights for access and use of these lands are upheld. We can support co-management. The Bears Ears National Monument was an amazing success, not only because of the tribal coalition that fought for it and won, but because it includes a really innovative co-management plan for the Bears Ears tribes. So it's not just being managed by the federal government, this national monument. And we can support various kinds of land back movements. And I've got the Intertribal Siskiyone Wilderness Council up here because you may have heard recent story about the 500 acres that they were recently given back. And one of the things that I think is worth noting about the story is that Save the Redwoods was the organization that bought this land and gave it to this council, which is a tribal coalition of 10 different tribes. And Save the Redwoods was one of the organizations that Madison Grant, that eugenicist that I talked about, founded. And so there's a sort of way in which that organization is going full circle to support land back movements. So I think there's a lot of really exciting work happening, scholarly and in terms of social movements right now. I want to leave plenty of time for discussion and question and answer. And I'm going to put up the information I share with you comes from so many different scholars and activists and advocates, but I want you to be able to see some of the books and I guess one film I've got up here that I recommend. And I know that some of the other articles I've recommended have been links to them and being dropped in the chat. So at this point, I'm gonna pause and take questions, and I will leave the screen up so you can jot down any books that you're interested in looking up later.
Wonderful. I think that I am so excited about your talk. Thank you so much. There is an awful lot of information, and I particularly want to thank you for not only deepening our understanding of the current issues, but also, and how we got to where we are, but also for the number of suggestions for different ways we can get involved. So at this point, for those of you in the audience, I'm going to ask that you either put your hand up or you, I'm going to try to get out of there. I'm going to go to a gallery. There are a few people who are going to be watching for me if you have a question for the chat, but I think while you're getting your questions ready and getting your hands up, I do have one question that's in my mind. You said you have over 250 students right now in this particular type of course. Is that correct?
I have 200 students in one course.
In one class.
And I teach several classes, but altogether, that's about how many students I'm working with right now.
That's amazing. And so what my question is, how do they respond to this information? This isn't news to all of them, but it should be news to a lot of them. So what's their response to understanding the complexity of public lands and outdoor recreation?
I have really amazing students, and I think that students are excited and eager for this information. Many of the students have a lot of knowledge and firsthand experience of racial inequity in public lands, that people come to my classes with all sorts of different kinds of lived experiences that informs the way they engage with this material. But I think by and large, people are excited to find out this information and add to it with their own knowledge. And it gives me a lot of hope for the future and the future of environmentalism. One of the reasons I was really excited to come teach at the University of Oregon and teach the environmental studies program is I often met so many environmental leaders in Oregon who had gone to the University of Oregon. And I liked the idea of being able to have those conversations with people who are going to be so influential in the state. And one of the things I've really learned at the university is that I have so much to learn from the students. It's not just me giving them information because of their own lived experience that they bring to the classroom.
That's great. I love that sense of hope for the future. I want to take a moment before I take the next question to kind of remind people that if you have not already done so, right now is a great time to go into the chat screen and actually go down to the comment section. There's 3 little buttons. If you go onto those 3 buttons, it'll allow you to save the chat to your computer. And what will happen then is and I noticed that Randy also put up a screenshot of specifically of the books as well. So that's a great way to have this and not have to worry about missing out on something. Victoria, you have a question?
Hi, Sarah. It's nice to actually meet you. Back in the, let's see, it must have been the early 1990s. I attended what I thought was a kind of a seminar on sacred native burial grounds, and turned out to be right in the middle of a fight between the Apaches on Mount Graham and who were fighting to keep an observatory off the top of Mount Graham. Are you familiar with that? About the people that wanted it were the corporation Max Planck from Germany and the Vatican, and they were doing it through the Arizona University, the University of Arizona. And it was mind-blowing. It just happened by sheer, I don't know, fate or whatever. I was with a bunch of Apaches when at the burial site, where they had been told explicitly through their lawyers, fighting for this sacred land, that there was going to be a moratorium on the building of the observatory. And when we went up there, and a select few went up to the actual site, they found that it had already been started. There was, paved, everything was paved. There were armed FBI folks there who were like, so that there wouldn't be any trouble. There were medicine men there. But what was so devastating was when they came back down from the site, the people that had been selected to go up there, and they realized how they had been just lied to, out and out lied to, that there had not been a moratorium, that this observatory was being built on a sacred burial ground, and witnessing, I can't even describe, I can't put into words what it was like. Are you familiar with that? And do you know anything more about corporations building sites on top of sacred burial grounds? I'm sure this isn't the only one.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that story. That is powerful and distressing and sadly not surprising. I don't know that I have any more details to share with you about that case. I would say, yes, it's in the chat. There's an ongoing fight in Hawaii about a university putting, an observatory on a sacred site. There is a long history of treating native lands as sacrifice zones, is the phrase that the scholars have used. It's horrific. And there's so many different kinds of examples like that, and so many different ways that we can get involved. And it's really, thank you for bringing that story to our attention.
Toby, and then we have a question in the chat from Karen.
Thank you, Dr. Wald, for your presentation, and nice to meet another Brunonian, and I was also accepted to read, so we have that in common. I would like to know a little bit more about your awareness or your transition from environmental activism to focusing on racial justice and equality and equity in our public lands, and maybe also talk about what you may have perceived is the challenge for people who are into environmentalism to come to this awareness.
That's a great question. I'm going to tell 2 stories. both from this period in late 90s. So I went to Reed. I was very involved in Cascadia Forest Alliance and in BARC during that time. When I graduated from Reed, I went and worked for a number of organizations, including the American Lands Alliance and BARC. I did some grant work with forest ethics. And then I went off to graduate school. And when I was an undergraduate doing this work, I wrote an undergraduate thesis that was talking about the ways our ideas about the wild and the West were problematic and constrained our environmental imaginations. And part of this was talking about the problem of thinking about national forests as our national heritage and our public land, because who is the our? And then I graduated and I found myself, one of my jobs is, at that point, I was interning with the American Lands Alliance, and my job was to raise visibility about old growth logging, which was partly about doing press work. And I found myself in front of a reporter who was asking me why we should not be clear cutting old growth forests on public lands. And all of a sudden, out of my mouth, even though I knew better intellectually, I started talking about our national heritage and that this was our national treasure. And it really stuck to me that I could intellectually know the problem, and yet in the moment of having to talk politically, what came out was what I knew was politically powerful. And the other moment I'm going to talk about was I was sitting at the base of a tree sit in an old growth timber sale. So I was at the bottom of the tree, basically doing support, keeping an eye out. And I was reading this novel by John Okada called No No Boy, which is about the Japanese internment during World War II. And I was really struck reading it that so much of civil disobedience in the Northwest Forest movement was based on the idea that white lives were going to be valued, that they weren't going to come in and kill a bunch of young white activists who were trying to protect the trees, and how that fit into the lack of care and value that so many people of color have experienced. And so those two things together made me realize I needed to do a lot more thinking about the intersections of race and environment. And part of why I went to graduate school, and part of why I ended up thinking about citizenship and immigration and race at the intersection of Asian American and Latinx studies, which is how I ended up working on farm labor for so many years. And BARC, I saw that question was in the chat, is a group that focuses on Mount Hood National Forest and protecting the wildlife and waters of Mount Hood National Forest. It was founded in post-Northwest Forest Plan to go monitor timber sales, commercial extractive projects on Mount Hood, from logging to pipeline building, and has been doing a lot of work in recent years to start thinking about what would it mean to manage Mount Hood National Forest for environmental justice. And so I was one of the first employees, maybe the first paid employee. And then I was on and off the board for, I would say, over a decade. I stepped off the board for the last time, I think, in 2019. And now I do a lot of collaboration, community collaboration with BARC, with my undergraduate and graduate students.
Great. Karen posted a question saying that she'd heard that the government was thinking of putting Native American tribes in charge of some of the national parks. And she was wondering if you ever heard anything about that, or if anything came from that.
I don't know if I have a lot of specific information. I know there's been a lot of excitement about Deb Haaland, who's the Secretary of the Interior and is Native American, and sort of an increased appreciation and recognition of tribal rights on federal lands coming from that, and a lot of work on, there has been increased co-management opportunities that have happened. I don't know that I haven't been following the ins and outs of specific policy things. So I'm not going to have the most accurate information. But I would say it is an exciting moment to think about what could happen for increased co-management. And of course, the restoration of Bears Ears, which was created under the Obama administration, dramatically shrunk during the Trump administration, and has now been restored under the Biden administration, and is a co-management project as part of that.
The question of co-management is a great one. As I was listening to you and you were talking about the dispossession of Native ways of traditionally caring for land and ensuring harvest and ensuring the things that were needed, and how the land has become very, very barren in some ways by not following that. Do you think there is a path forward for some joint planning on some of these national parks and the forestry side to really look at a different kind of management of some of these lands?
Yes, I think it's actually been happening. And Mark Spence, who is one of the historians I referenced, has actually been doing a lot of work for years around this. And we see it in Death Valley National Park, when it became a national park. The Shoshone got some of their land back and have been engaged in co-management there. That was one of the first places where you really saw a lot of co-management. The Kuruk have been doing a lot of co-management. A lot of individual tribes have been pushing for and getting co-management practices. And one of the things to think about in terms of national parks and federal lands is you do have landscapes that are very expensive to manage, right? And you have Native communities, Native tribes that have been deprived of resources. And I think what's an exciting possibility about co-management is it doesn't just put the financial burden on tribes.
Right.
It allows for tribal management and tribal decision making, while also having the federal government, as it should, shoulder a lot of the cost, because the poverty of Indigenous people in the U.S. has been caused by the actions of the federal government.
Great points. I see that Adrienne and Bernadette have their hand up.
Hi. My question is about native lands that are adjacent to national parks. First of all, I'd like to encourage anyone who goes to a park to seek out those lands. When I went to Glacier, I went to the Blackfoot Reservation, to their museum. And an issue that came up was about some of the artifacts they had there that were returned to them from white people they had made them for. And the issue becomes about repatriation. I know when I went to Yosemite, there's all these native baskets, but the issue for the Blackfeet was they had to give up their precious things in order to survive because they were starving, so that museums or parks could show them in their hotels. And I'm wondering, as we look at repatriation of artifacts and art, are the national park hotels, which may contain a lot of these things, have you heard anything about whether or not there are requests for returns because those items were obtained from Native peoples under duress who were otherwise going to starve, as the Blackfeet were?
That's a great question. I haven't heard that, but that doesn't mean that's not happening. It's not an area that I have researched. So your knowledge on this, I'm guessing, is superior to mine. So I don't have any concrete answers on that. I would say a lot of concessionaires. So a lot of the national park hotels, right, they're private businesses. A lot of them are managed by Bon Appetit, which has its own issues with the prison industrial complex. And I think in the case of the Blackfeet and their conflict with the Glacier National Park, and as you mentioned, their starvation, I think one of the things to mention is part of what's happening here is these treaties that should guarantee the Blackfeet the ability to leave the reservation lands and to be able to get food products from the lands that are being managed as Glacier National Park, right? They're not allowed to do that. And so part of the reason that there's starvation is ecological disruption and not following treaty rights. So I think that's, a great question. I don't have a good answer for you other than I think that's an important issue to be considering.
Thank you.
Okay. Other questions from those?
Carla, there's something from Toby in chat that looks pretty interesting. Maybe you want to read that?
Sure, I'll read what Toby posted. It said, "Thank you for mentioning No No Boy. My mother, soon to turn 90 years old, joined me to talk about Japanese American incarceration for Take Part just 2 months ago. She was incarcerated at Tule Lake, California, and Heart Mountain, Wyoming." Wow. Yeah.
Thank you so much for bringing that up. I know, reading that in the context of this talk, I'm also thinking about the ways in which so many incarceration camps were on native land. I mean, they're all on native land, but they were often on recognized native land, on reservations, and the complicated different histories of incarceration and imprisonment and suffering and injustice that happen, the sort of links in particular between the Japanese American and Native American communities because of incarceration.
Wow.
Yes, the Tule Lake location just south of the border, south of Klamath Falls, about 5-10 miles, is on the Modoc historical lands. And there's been conflict that I think has been encouraged between the Japanese Americans community and the Modocs regarding that particular land. I am happy to say that when I attended a pilgrimage to Heart Mountain, Wyoming, which is just 10 minutes outside of Cody, if you go to Cody, you should absolutely go to the Interpretive Center. We had a Native American elder talk about, and I forget what the Native American name for Heart Mountain is. I think it, but it's of course a sacred mountain, and he told stories about what that mountain means to his tradition, and it was a really beautiful acknowledgement and shared experience. So I've seen both the conflict and the cooperation between the Japanese Americans and the ancestors of those who were incarcerated and the Native American lands on which they were incarcerated.
Adrienne, is your hand still up, or do you have another question?
Question, Bernadette.
Okay.
So on the other end of that, I think they're more national park services, but it's about how welcome you feel on native land, and that a lot of these monuments, which are maybe jointly owned or park owned, especially in the South, have the reenactments which ignore Black stories on plantations or ignore the Black stories on presidential sites. But more importantly, I believe there was something in Smithsonian about a dozen years ago that they actually are mistelling the histories to little Black children while they are dressed in these white colonialist outfits. And I'm wondering if any of your research has seen that intersection where we currently have white reenactors giving false histories on public lands. That would make people of color very unwelcome.
Yeah. I taught in Kentucky for a year, and I went on a plantation tour that I was told was going to be one of the better ones for actually addressing Black history, and it did not at all. And they got very uncomfortable when I started asking questions. So, you know, I know this is a real, I know personally from that experience how widespread that is as an issue. That was not public land, right? That was a private tour. My research has been very US West focused. So I would say I'm not surprised to hear that. And I think there's a long history of struggle between local managements of sites and the federal government on particular things. And I think different histories of how the federal government handles this. I'm just thinking about the 2017 memorandum from Obama on addressing diversity. And then under the Trump administration, right, where you weren't supposed to even mention diversity, you weren't supposed to mention climate change, you weren't supposed to have diversity trainings for staff. And then of course, you know, now there's back to being DI work being allowed within the agencies. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I don't have anything else to add to it other than I wouldn't be surprised to hear those conflicts are happening.
My final question, I hope, is given that current discussion on CRT, do you think you could teach this class if you were in one of the states that prohibits it?
So I would say that I don't know what I think there's there's obviously problems with the way that CRT is being demonized, often in a way in which a critical race theory, people don't understand what actual critical race theory is. They don't understand the way it came out of a particular legal discourse. That's not what people who are concerned about CRT are talking about, but they are truly talking about and concerned about people addressing racial injustice and telling the true history of the United States. And I think absolutely there's going to be continuing conflicts about teaching these kinds of histories in states that ban that. I think individual states with their individual laws and how people are getting around it is a state by state, case by case basis. But yeah, obviously this the way I'm thinking about race in this context is going to trouble people who are using critical race theory as a scare tactic to say they don't want to learn histories that are going to threaten or make white people uncomfortable to learn. And, I always tell my students, if you're not uncomfortable in class, you're not learning anything. The point of education is to be uncomfortable and to hear things you disagree with and to learn to think critically about it.
Has anyone pushed back on you for teaching this? I believe Eugene was a sundown town. That's why I asked.
I mean, in terms of students, I often have students who are very uncomfortable with the information, and I have a lot of conversations with them, and I tell them part of the class is to learn to listen to perspectives that are different from them. I have not had any challenges from the administration or concerns. One of the courses I teach is a required course for the environmental studies major. We, as an environmental studies program, believe you need to hear the true history of environmentalism in the United States and environmental justice in order to get a degree in environmental studies. I don't think how I'm teaching is distinct from how the program as a whole approaches these issues.
No, and I think that you're all of you in the field of study and those who are documenting and writing books and articles, they become more and more critical, because as we go through ups and downs in our history unfolding, people's comfort levels changes, people's, things change all the time. But having this well documented and well understood as starting, somewhere, it's a good start, and it won't just disappear. So I really appreciated the way in your talk today, you really challenged us in a way that's very important. Many of us have talked about for a long time, we've got to challenge all our unknown biases. We have to challenge everything that we think we understand so that we can have a true understanding of the pictures of the real history that's unfolded. Because we all came to our understanding based on where we grew up, where we learned from, how it was taught. So I think it's critically important that we have this. And Laura put a note in the chat, which I think kind of sums it up. It says, this has been super informative and thought-provoking. And that's the best. I think to really make us think is really important. I see I have two more hands up, and I see a lot of notes in the chat thanking you for the talk and things like that, and for opening our eyes to the complexity of environmental studies. That came from Brenda. So that eye-opening is a great step. So I have two more questions that I'm going to take, and then we're going to wrap up the formal portion of our evening together, but we'll still be online for those who want to have more conversations. So Toby, I think your hand was up first, followed by Marianne.
Thank you. Yes, you have opened our eyes and made us aware of new things to think about, and you've provided us with lots of resources to learn more. What direct actions or call to action do you have for those of us who want to try and make a difference in terms of equity and equality with our public lands and public land policy?
I would say pay attention to cases that are going to come up locally where it's important to support tribal sovereignty, and important to support tribal sovereignty even feels like what the tribe is maybe asking for isn't how you, if you're not a tribal member, would think about those issues. I think that's always really hard. It's really easy to support tribal sovereignty when a tribe is asking for something that, you know, I individually agree with. And I think being able to support tribal sovereignty, whether or not it's the decision I would make, is important. I think that's key. I think supporting the organizations in Portland, Latino Outdoors, Outdoor Afro, Wild Diversity, there's a huge number of these organizations that are doing this work, and the more mainstream groups that are trying to have these conversations. I know that there's some, in Portland in particular, a lot of work about the Mount Hood National Forest Plan, which is super out of date. It's from 1990, like that's before the 1994 Environmental Justice Executive Order. Getting a new forest, you know, supporting work to get a new forest plan or new forest management for Mount Hood that thinks about environmental justice, that thinks about racial justice, that thinks about climate change, things that aren't in the 1990 plan that still how Mount Hood National Forest as an urban forest is managed. I think those are all things, especially as folks in or near the Portland metro area, you can be doing and thinking about.
Great. Marianne.
Hi. Well, first of all, thank you very much for this. As everybody else saying, this was very eye-opening. I learned a lot. This question is actually on behalf of, she's showing up as Team Yoda, Grace. She's not feeling well, so that's why I'm asking for her. She's part Native. She wants to know, do you think the ongoing unmanaged wildfires destroying forest is driving the need for management from Native Americans? Could you address that?
Yeah, thanks. I think that when we think about why these wildfires are happening in the ways that they're happening, partly it's driven by climate change, which we know is caused by capitalism, industrialization, colonialism combined. And it's also exacerbated by the lack of traditional management strategies. And I do think that if federal management, the more and more federal management becomes co-management or truly land back, the better the ecosystem resilience would be. And I think particularly in areas, there's a lot of really amazing case studies on the Crook. That's why I'm going back to the Crook and their relationship to fire, and things are tribally specific and locally specific. So you can't take a case study from one tribe in one particular area and sort of apply it nationally. But I think, I do think that part of the change in the conversation around fire, maybe it is coming from prescribed burns and sort of saying, oh, well, maybe these traditional managements, there's a history of knowledge, but I think it also comes from the hard, long work and struggles of tribes who continued cultural resilience and continued to be a presence on these lands and have pushed for these lands and pushed for their protection through return to tribal management, and have really been, I think, at the forefront of forging these relationships with the federal government.
Great.
Thank you.
Wow, this has been a really wonderful evening. So Dr. Wald, on behalf of all of us, I want to offer my thanks. And I want all of you to know that as this video becomes posted, it'll be available on YouTube. We'll send out a link. But I want all of you to also know that a lot of people wanted to be here tonight who couldn't. So please share the link and let people go and watch it. It'll be wonderful. And there's some other videos there you might enjoy.